Bram Stoker is perhaps the most important person in history when it comes to the popular perception of vampires. His 1897 seminal novel Dracula and its later adaptations defined what we know as a vampire to this very day. The book is such a fantastic combination of elements introduced in prior vampire stories all boiled down to create the terrifying figure of Dracula. Carmilla, the vampire, Varney the vampire. The impact of these stories came together to give us the most iconic vampire in fiction. With the later unofficial adaptation Nosferatu introducing the weakness to sunlight, we can already see essentially every element of the modern vampire as early as 1922. It's impossible to imagine what kind of vampire stories would be made today without Stoker's novel. Bram Stoker is so synonymous with Dracula that it can be easy to see why it overshadowed his other works. In fact, Dracula wasn't even close to the only book that Stoker wrote. His first book, The Primrose Path, was first published in 1875. He continued writing novels and short stories until his final book, The Lair of the White Worm, was published in 1911, a year before his death in 1912. This book is a sort of attempt at recapturing the magic he harnessed while writing Dracula. It's a supernatural folk horror story that uses a real-life legend known as the Lambton Worm from County Durham in England. It follows a man from Australia, Adam Sultan, who travels to Derbyshire to inherit his great-uncle's estate. While he's there, he meets the inhabitants of the neighboring estates. This includes Edgar Caswell, a man obsessed with mesmerization and his strange kite, Mimi and Lilla Watford, a pair of cousins looking for husbands, and Lady Arabella March, a peculiar woman who may or may not be the reincarnation of the legendary worm. Over the course of the story, several strange occurrences happen. Adam's snake-hunting mongoose charges at Arabella and she shoots it with her revolver. Edgar's slave follows Arabella suspiciously and ends up falling down the well hole on her property. Edgar becomes obsessed with flying his kite and thinks he's become a god. And to top it all off, there's a love triangle thrown in for good measure. To be perfectly honest, the book is just not very good. It's a horribly racist and misogynistic story filled with predictable plot twists, a rushed ending, and an equally rushed romantic subplot. It is completely lacking in mystery, like how the reader is told early on that Lady Arabella March's estate has the alternate title of The Lair of the White Worm. There are no thrills or scares to be had, especially to a reader who doesn't consider the mere existence of a black character to be part of the horror. It's hard to care about anything at all when even the third-person narration acknowledges how racist it is. It has none of the qualities that made Dracula such a compelling book. So, where do the vampires come into this? There's a strange snake lady who might be immortal, but she's not really a vampire. She's even described in the book as having no supernatural powers, as far as the characters know. There are no vampires to be found anywhere within the book. Well, that's where the film adaptation comes in to fix that glaring issue. The year is 1986. Ken Russell, a controversial and transgressive filmmaker, has just released his latest film, Gothic. This was a fictionalized retelling of the vacation taken by Percy and Mary Shelley and John William Polidori that ultimately led to the birth of Frankenstein and the Vampire, two of the most influential Gothic horror stories of all time. The film is infused with Russell's style, turning the true story into a surreal psychosexual horror romp. It's a movie about freaks, directed by a freak, and made specifically for freaks. Gothic is most definitely worth watching for any fan of classic Gothic literature. The US-based Vestron Pictures released the film on video. Eager to work with Ken Russell again, they made an offer to him to release another movie. With Gothic, he explored the history of Gothic literature in his own style. For his next movie, why not adapt the work of another Gothic author? Bram Stoker was an obvious choice, as Russell was already a fan of his work. But even by this time in the 80s, Dracula adaptations had already been done to death, no pun intended. So in the end, it was decided that an adaptation of Stoker's final book would be made. But it wasn't going to be a straight adaptation of the book. To do so would be a foolish choice. The book is such a mess that it would just never work on the big screen. And so, what we ended up getting was a piece of art that had little to do with the book of the same name. Russell took the idea of a mythological giant snake inhabiting an estate guarded by a malevolent woman and gave his own spin to it. The end result would become The Lair of the White Worm, an adaptation in name only, released in theaters in October of 1988. Lady Arabella March, a reincarnation of the titular worm in the book, became Lady Sylvia Marsh, an immortal seductive Ophidian vampire who is a priestess for the snake god Dionin. She has fangs and spits venom, and she even has a weakness to snake charming. The setting was updated from the 1860s to modern day. The legend of the Lambton Worm became the fictional Dampton Worm and is introduced through a Celtic folk punk song. The whole subplot about the kite was completely thrown out. The gothic horror book was transformed into a folk horror / black comedy hybrid movie, and it has a surreal, dreamlike atmosphere. If you've seen a Ken Russell film before, you should know what to expect. The basic plot of the movie goes something like this. Angus Flint travels to Derbyshire from Scotland to study archaeology. He excavates a massive snake-like skull, and after learning the myth of the Dampton Worm, he believes there may be a connection between the two. Lord James Dampton, descendant of the hero who supposedly slew the Great Worm, encourages Angus to investigate more. Meanwhile, sisters Eve and Mary Trent are searching for clues regarding their parents who went missing in the grove of the nearby Temple House, home of mysterious Lady Sylvia Marsh. From there, things unfold in a rather strange way. You've got snake vampires, surreal dream sequences, a folk punk song, bagpipe snake charming, cave dwelling, a massive worm puppet, and the greatest use of a Zweihander you will ever see, all distilled into a 93-minute runtime. Ken Russell has taken the most basic elements of the book and transformed it into a masterful blend of folk and gothic horror. The most famous imagery of the movie is of a giant snake contorting around the body of Christ on the cross, and it's used to show pagan beliefs conflicting with Christianity. Russell has used the Derbyshire setting as a backdrop to explore two different ideologies. This is reflected in the characters, where Sylvia is the leader of an ancient pagan cult who worships a god who exists in the physical world. And while we never see the main characters going to church or anything, the Trent sisters do have a crucifix on their wall. It's important to note that the movie isn't trying to solve this religious conflict in any way. Ken Russell was a former Catholic who left the religion after his own film The Devils made him re-examine his faith. In an interview with Fangoria magazine, he mentions that serpents were not always seen as evil like they are now.
You have to remember that in olden times, the serpent was not an image of evil, which is how it's associated today. It was an image of good, a sign of healing. The serpent in the Garden of Eden wasn't evil. All he was saying was, look, you don't have to shiver all night long. There's something called clothing. He was just indexing the possibilities. Well, we listened, didn't we?
Lady Sylvia may be the villain of the film, but we never exactly get to see what her cult actually does. Maybe it's due to budgetary issues, but the only other members we see of her cult are the ones she turns into vampires. She's incredibly charismatic and seductive, and she's willing to lie so as not to implicate herself. She isn't defeated because of the main hero's faith, but because of their willingness to put their lives in danger. Ken Russell is no stranger to provocative and controversial imagery in his films. If we view the White Worm as a symbol of healing within the context of a plot, then perhaps destroying it at the end of the movie was the wrong decision. What would happen if the worm was able to roam free from the confines of Sylvia's restrictive lair? Like any great film, the pieces are all there for the audience to pick up on and interpret however they wish. I personally find Lady Sylvia to be maybe my favorite movie vampire, so I tend to root for her every time I watch it. Her personality is full of flamboyance and dry humor, so I'm just drawn to her over every other character. It's for that reason that the casting of Lady Sylvia Marsh was the most important of all to get right. Ken Russell originally wanted Tilda Swinton for the role, but she declined after reading the script. In her place, we got Amanda Donahoe, an up-and-coming star. She had just starred in the movie Castaway with Oliver Reed, a regular of Ken Russell's movies. Russell sent her the script and she accepted right after reading it. In an article with the New York Times promoting the film, she had this to say:
I read it and couldn't stop laughing, and I decided instantly that I would love to play the part of Lady Sylvia Marsh. First of all, the opportunity to play a woman who is basically a fantasy woman. There are no boundaries, therefore I could do exactly as I chose with that lady.
Donahoe brought an energy to the movie highly reminiscent of the vampire films of the 70s. Sylvia is a seductive and calculated killer, which makes it all the more jarring towards the end of the film when she shows up painted blue. She lures in her victims with her assets only to paralyze them with her venom. Donahoe also mentions reading Interview with the Vampire to prepare for her role, and she learned quite a bit from that book.
I didn't want her to be some sort of vampire bimbo. I really wanted her to be a sort of incredibly sophisticated and ageless woman, and I guess reading that book gave me a great insight into evil.
She also talks about how Sylvia is actually pretty funny.
Lady Sylvia lures her victims to their deaths, and does it with an enormous amount of humor. Most of it is her private joke.
Sylvia ends up being the funniest character in the cast. The first time we see her vampiric nature come forth is when she spits out venom on a crucifix. Amanda Donahoe was the perfect choice for the role, and she ends up being the most memorable part of the movie. For the two male leads, we got Peter Capaldi and Hugh Grant. Both actors were relatively new at the time, but they ended up being the biggest stars to come out of the movie. Capaldi plays Angus Flint, and he does a great job of portraying the character's strange charm. Angus is a dead serious Scot who kicks off the whole plot when he uncovers an ancient fossil resembling a giant skull. He's also the main hero of the story once everything goes wrong. There's a scene of him playing bagpipes to charm one of the snake vampires, and it's just as ridiculous as that sounds. Capaldi plays the role of a smart but reluctant hero perfectly. The Lair of the White Worm was the first major starring role for the actor, and he later ended up becoming one of the most famous actors to come out of Scotland, starring in Doctor Who, Paddington, and The Suicide Squad. Hugh Grant plays the role of James Dampton, ancestor of the legendary John Dampton, who is said to have slain the Great Worm centuries ago. This was the only horror film he appeared in all the way until 2024's Heretic. Apparently, he's embarrassed by his acting in the film, and I kinda get why. Grant seems like he's not fully committed to the movie, and it shows in his acting, where he seems too reserved to go all out. But I think it ends up working out in favor of the character. It makes James come off as a smug but likable guy. He sorta acts as the Van Helsing of the story, and I mean that in the way Van Helsing is portrayed in the original Dracula novel, not the legendary vampire hunter he's seen as now. He's the one who is able to put all the clues together to figure things out without rolling out anything supernatural. Hugh Grant would of course go on to be the biggest actor to come out of the movie, starring in movies like Love Actually, Notting Hill, and Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves. Vestron Pictures wanted an American in the cast, so they suggested Catherine Oxenberg for the part of Eve Trent. Oxenberg, the daughter of Princess Elizabeth of Yugoslavia, was at the time most known for her role as Amanda Carrington on the show Dynasty. The Lair of the White Worm was her first role in a major feature film, and I think she fits the character well. Eve is the most traumatized character over the course of the movie. She, along with her sister Mary, still mourns the loss of her parents over a year ago. Eve is subjected to several surreal visions from Sylvia's venom and is later kidnapped to be used as a human sacrifice to the titular White Worm. She's a tragic character that is treated with more respect than the typical damsel in distress, and it's shown just how much the events of the movie have affected her. For the part of Eve's sister Mary, Sammy Davis was cast. Davis had appeared in a few cult films before this, such as Mona Lisa, Lionheart, and Hope and Glory. Mary Trent is part of what drew me to the movie from the very beginning. Her accent was so striking to me that it added to the very strange and surreal opening scene. Like her sister Eve, Mary is also dealing with the loss of her parents. She confides in Angus in an early scene which motivates him to investigate the mystery further. If Mary is the Lucy Westenra of the story, then Eve is Mina Harker. She works with Angus and James to rescue her sister, while the script makes sure she gets enough attention devoted to her feelings for her parents. Paul Brooke, Stratford Johns, Gina McKee, and Chris Pitt make up the supporting cast. Imogen Clare and Christopher Gable play the parents of the Trent sisters. For the director of photography, Russell brought on his previous collaborator Dick Bush, and you have no idea how hard it was to find a picture of a guy named Dick Bush. He had previously worked as a cinematographer on vampire movies Twins of Evil and Dracula AD 1972, so he was no stranger to the genre. Stanislav Sirowitz was brought on as composer, and he managed to create a striking and memorable soundtrack. The music manages to be both ethereal and terrifying at the same time, a perfect blend for the tone of the film. It's hard to talk about The Lair of the White Worm without mentioning one of its most memorable aspects, and that is the phallic imagery present in basically every scene. It shows up everywhere, from minor background props to Hugh Grant using a marker to simulate an erection, and of course, the ceremonial strap-on that Sylvia wears at the climax of the movie, which I don't think I can show for obvious reasons. Even the cars driven by the characters have that look to them. It's entirely possible that Ken Russell saw White Worm in the title and decided to make the entire thing into a dick joke. Russell himself even called the titular worm a fake phallic worm 200 feet long. There's plenty of room for interpretation to be had for all of this. It could be seen as the film having commentary on the sexualization of women against their will. The dream sequence that James experiences lends credence to this. His obvious metaphorical boner rises after he watches Sylvia and his girlfriend Mary wrestle on the ground in their tight-fitting outfits. Sylvia's entire character takes advantage of her sexuality to prey on unsuspecting men. It's not really that far-fetched of an interpretation considering that this is from the same man who directed The Devils, a movie that explores its heavy themes of sexual repression with graphic detail. The phallic imagery is of course part of the movie's black comedy, but it doesn't really have to be played just for laughs. Before I read the book for this video, I was under the impression that it was Bram Stoker's second attempt at a vampire story. I spent the whole book waiting for the reveal that Lady Arabella March is a vampire, but it just never came. As it turns out, Ken Russell had originally written a screenplay for Dracula at some point, but it never turned into anything. In an interview with Fangoria, Russell explains that he read The Lair of the White Worm on a friend's recommendation and was disappointed by it, but what drew him to doing an adaptation was that it was a story about a snake-worshipping cult that took place so close to him. He was drawn specifically to the priestess that lives in the service of the worm, so he made sure to focus on her. It's impossible to tell exactly why Russell decided to make White Worm a vampire story, but my guess is that he probably just really wanted to make a vampire movie. Later on in the interview, he discusses his planned Dracula adaptation further. He talks about how much he cared for his planned script, and how it stayed true to the novel, but would delve further into Dracula's motivation for living forever. He also mentions that his favorite horror movie he saw that year was Near Dark. It's safe to assume the guy just liked vampires, and who could blame him? Regardless of his reason for including them, I'm glad he did. The Lair of the White Worm is my favorite vampire movie, and remains an endearing cult classic to many others. The movie's surreal, small-town mystery has caused some to draw some comparisons to Twin Peaks, and I can see why. There's an almost indescribable charm to both caused by their dream sequences, likable cast, and soap opera-style acting. They are both driven by the loss of somebody close to the characters, and someone unrelated comes in to help investigate. It's certainly a strange coincidence that the last movie Russell mentioned watching in theaters was Blue Velvet. And while I agree with this sentiment, I find it hard to really draw any comparisons at all. I can see shades of Ken Russell's usual style. I can also see influences from vampire movies of the 70s and 80s like Daughters of Darkness, The Hunger, Twins of Evil, and Herzog's Nosferatu. It's a folk horror movie, it's a black comedy, it's a mystery, it's gothic horror, and it's a vampire movie. It's all of these things and more. It masterfully blends all these influences together to create a truly unique film experience. And the best way to experience that is to go and watch The Lair of the White Worm for yourself. Thank you so much for watching this video about one of my favorite movies. If you enjoyed it, go ahead and like and subscribe and leave a comment about what movie you want to see covered on this channel next. We're thinking about other vampire movies, body horror stuff, and just other weirdo movies. It should all be fun to talk about. Again, thank you so much for watching, and bye.